pretty smart. Not actually smart, but they do a lot of cool shit in response to environmental things. So we're going to talk about that. Huh. So, what are they? So these are just some of the parts. Don't mind my animating skills. Got needles, which are specialized leaves. So they're kind of like snorkels with legs, The above ground part's just the snorkel bit, and then the roots are like the legs because they're important. And yeah, I was pretty tired when I made this. So what types of trees do we have? So we got deciduous. So they drop and regrow their leaves every year. Coniferous have needles, so just specialized pointy leaves that they keep them all year round. And then we've got tamaracks, which are both. Well, I mean, they're coniferous, but they drop their needles. So probably could have looked up why they do that, but I don't know. So, but they look real nice in the fall. Go find some golden trees. Ooh, okay. What are some of the coolest individual trees? So we've got Hyperion is a coastal redwood in Redwood National Park in California, and that bitch is 115 meters tall, or 300. I think. Or no, Paige gets it. This is for Paige, and then 380 feet for everyone else.
Meters for Paige.
Meters for Paige. Hashtag. And then the biggest by volume, also insane, General Sherman, which is a sequoia in Sequoia National Park, which recently had to be wrapped with a heat blanket to prevent it from getting burned down, which I think worked, so that's good. I don't really know what that means. I'm not good at cubic volumes, but it's big, and I'm fairly confident in that assertion. So
that's real big.
Cubic feet and cubic meters or something.
Yeah. Exactly. So I don't know. I can't visualize that very well myself, but big. And then the oldest is almost 5,000 years old, which is also in fucking California, dude. Can you share some of the cool trees, please?
Yeah,
Tatiana,
go ahead. You can have them.
If you want to just talk to California and just see,
please?
I don't know, maybe you can send them on tour around.
I'll send them a text real quick.
Okay, thanks. That's great.
Yeah.
It's a bristlecone pine in the White Mountains and Depeche old. So yeah, there's some real cool trees both in age and size out there. So how many trees are there on Earth? So the estimated total biomass is 300 gigatons. This shows all plants, which make up 450 gigatons. Gigatons of carbon is that metric. So for visualization, that's plants. So like this line would be trees. These are all animals, and that little sliver, 0.06 gigatons, is all humans. So there's a lot. There are a lot of trees out there. Oh no, I forgot about this. Oops, fuck. Yeah, I did math to figure this out. I don't remember what it was, but that should really help clear things up, I think. I'll just let you all read that. So there's a lot.
I am not surprised that you did the math. I'm not.
Can I read that part out loud, please?
Sure.
To help visualize this, you could fill out Mount Doom with all the massive trees on Earth if each 37.5 gigatons of trees was the size of a limited edition Shenron Dragon Ball Z Funko Pop action figure, which we all know what that looks like.
Yeah, exactly. I think that really clears it up. I can speak for all of us when I say that's a lot.
Oh, I got
Analogy stretch.
Yeah. So, anyways.
Look at that little smiley.
Little smiling tree. Tree benefits.
Tree blush?
Actually, you know what? That's a great point, Palka. Trees and being in nature linked to increased mood. So, bam, trees make you happy like this happy tree. But also oxygen. They maintain soil quality and mitigate slope erosion in mountainous areas or hilly areas or just areas with soil. So everywhere. We get some nice shade, keep everything cool. And a lot of things make houses out of trees, it turns out. So that's nice. They're also a large carbon sink. So They absorb a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So shout out trees in the climate change fight, please. So trees are great. So what are the different parts of trees? We already went over the snorkel with legs, aka the leaves, branches, trunk, and roots. Within the trunk and all other tissues, but the trunk's the easiest visualization. We've got living parts. So the phloem carries sugars in the form, like so food, from the roots to the growing regions. So that can also be down to the roots. The phloem can travel both ways, uses more active transport. That would be this part here. And then the xylem, it's kind of alive, but they're dead cells. So it's sort of, it's kind of alive, kind of dead. But it carries water from the roots to the growing regions, but the xylem only goes up. So if any water needs to come back down at any point, it can be transferred over to the phloem and incorporated with the sugar in the form of sap to move back down, but the xylem only goes up. So the dead parts would be the outer bark, which is old phloem, protects against pests and the elements, and then the heartwood on the inside, which is dead xylem and phloem cells as well, provides a strong center and just sort of helps the tree not get fall down. So, tree growth. So I'm sure everyone's seen a tree cookie before. You can count them up and see how old the tree is. You can also identify different parts. So the darker part would be the heartwood here, and this would be the sapwood. So that's like the xylem, and then phloem would be this bit, and then the bark is on the outside there. So yeah, I think everyone's familiar with the idea of counting out ages. The lighter part of the lines is the growth in the spring and the early summer, so it's actively growing quite a lot. And then late summer and fall is the darker line where it slows down, and that encompasses the 1 year. So the cadmium adds wood cells. So the cadmium's right here to the inside and bark cells in the form of phloem to the outside. So the tree gets wider as it grows. You can also gain clues as to major events or growth conditions across a tree's lifetime just by analyzing the growth rings. So here you see a scar from a forest fire that didn't kill the tree, grew right over it, kept going. Dry seasons would be indicated by narrower growth rings, and rainy seasons with more favorable conditions would yield more growing. You can also use tree growth rings to see, so like when fires happen, but also it can be used for helping gain clues into prehistoric climate. So with glaciers, for example, they've used tree rings from trees that are off the edge of current glaciers. So say 50 meters away from the extent of a glacier that we know of today, they can cut the tree down, take a look at the cookie, and sometimes they'll see like compressed rings on one side for a period of time, which indicates that the glacier had actually grown up to the extent of that tree and was pressing up against it. So this has been used in certain areas to determine like how far a glacier had advanced over time. And they can give an idea of like cooling and warming patterns in history just by cutting these guys open and taking a look. So yeah, pretty neat. More than just kind of how old a tree is, you can also get clues as to what's happened and what that tree's done seen. Okay, so now we're going to chop into tree physiology a little bit. There's a bit of physics in this, not too much because I don't remember enough to get detailed with it anyways. But yeah, okay. So trees need a lot of water. Almost a continuous intake is required to replace water loss in transpiration. But how do they actually get it? Like everyone knows that the water comes from the roots, but it's not actually a super simple answer. You can't just slurp it up with a straw. There's no muscles involved. So you have to do that slurping motion by taking advantage of the laws of physics. So transpiration is the opening of stomata to intake carbon dioxide and release oxygen. And as a byproduct, water gets released as well. So it would be nice if trees could just retain all their water, keep it forever, not have to worry too much about continual uptake, but it doesn't work like that. So they lose water every time they need to breathe. So how does transpiration work? We'll go into that into a second, but it relies on pressure concepts, specifically pressure gradients. So water, as well as gases and ions, will move across a membrane to return to equilibrium across the membrane. So they always want to be at a net zero. And if that equilibrium is broken, it creates a pressure gradient, and either water or a gas or ions will flow across the membrane to try to get to a state of equilibrium where concentrations are the same on either side of the membrane. So that's going to be an important concept. Hopefully Hopefully that makes sense for everyone. Yell at me if it doesn't. Great. So transpiration. Trees need to open their stomata to breathe, quote unquote. So to facilitate photosynthesis, they need to take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and release oxygen for photosynthesis. I think everyone's familiar with the general concept of photosynthesis. That's when they take carbon dioxide, oxygen, and water and create, or sorry, they intake carbon dioxide, sunlight, and water and release oxygen and sugars, which they then use to fuel their growth. The oxygen is expelled as waste. That's sort of the overhead concept. It gets a lot more complicated. I couldn't re-understand my notes from the university course I took on this, so I'm not going to talk about that today because holy shit. But in the process, they release water to the atmosphere, which is not great if you rely on water as the intake for this process. So the rate of transpiration depends on a few different things, which are dependent on the atmosphere at the time of transpiration. So saturation vapor pressure describes the absolute amount of water vapor that the air can hold when it's fully saturated. So how much total water vapor can be suspended in the air? And that amount depends on, it's a function of the temperature of the air. So generally at colder temperatures, the air can't hold as much. At warmer temperatures, the air can hold more vaporized water. It also depends on the relative humidity, which is a function of the absolute humidity divided by this saturation vapor pressure. So basically the absolute humidity is how much vaporized water there is in the air. So the relative is then therefore how much vaporized water there is in the air divided by how much could possibly be held in the air at that temperature. And that's your relative humidity. And then as well, the vapor pressure difference between the leaf and the atmosphere. So this is all going on. So transpiration occurs on the leaves. And the rate is ultimately the biggest driver is going to be this vapor pressure difference. So if you have a high concentration of water vapor within the cells of the leaf and not much in the atmosphere, you're going to lose that water vapor more quickly than if it was, like in the middle of a rainforest, for example, and there's a lot of mist in the air. Then the trees aren't going to lose that water as quickly because there isn't that pressure gradient driving that release of water into the atmosphere. But it's not just dependent on the atmosphere. They do have a bit of control over this process through their stomata. So stomata are specialized cells that can open and close, also in response to environmental variables, but sort of different ones than just would control transpiration. So this is pretty important because if they just had holes in their leaves, they'd lose too much water and become desiccated and die pretty quickly. So this way they can sort of control their transpiration rates during the day, for example, when there's greater light intensity and greater temperature. That'll drive the pressure gradient, the vapor pressure gradient higher, and they'll lose water faster. So the stomata their main function is to control water loss. So there are cells called guard cells, which are living cells adjacent to the stomata, and they swell sort of together or shrink apart depending on turgor pressure. So that's the pressure within the cells that's mainly determined by water, but also ions. So this pressure can be controlled by pumping ions in and out of guard cells actively. So for example, potassium is the main ion that's used in these ion pumps. So by pumping potassium into the cells, you end up swelling the guard cells, and that opens the stomata. And then by pumping potassium out of the cells, the guard cells shrink, and then the stomata close up. So this whole process can respond to light levels as well. So there's a lot going on. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but basically, in response to blue light coming into the leaf, there's a protein that absorbs the light and binds to a hormone. The process of binding to this hormone triggers a chemical response, which then yields the ions transported in and out of the cells to alter the pressure, the trigger pressure of the cells, and that opens and closes the stomata. So it's actually quite a complicated process, but it's pretty nuanced as well. And you get that direct response to sunlight to sort of compensate for the fact that during the day the vapor pressure difference is higher and transpiration rates will be higher as well. So now you can control your water loss, but how do you get more water? Because inevitably they're going to lose some water regardless. So glad you asked myself. Water makes up 80 to 95% of the mass of growing tissues in a tree. So trees really need to keep, as much as they can. The uptake of water in the roots relies on the loss of water in the leaves. So this is dependent on the cohesion tension theory. This is responsible for about 95% of water transport through the trees. So the cohesion tension theory relies on the inherent properties of water. So strong hydrogen bonds, which yields to high cohesion. So the tendency of water to attach to itself is greater than its adhesion or its tendency to attach to anything else. So with that, this is a bit more details into the cohesion tension theory and how it applies to trees. So firstly, it does rely on a continuous, unbroken water column. So you can kind of think of this as a current. So if you think about electrons running through a wire creates a current of electricity. It's kind of like that. It's when it's continuous and unbroken, a continuous and unbroken water column. It's sort of like current running through a wire. So we get solar radiation input into the leaves. This supplies the energy for this whole process. Water vapor diffuses out of the leaf. So from an area of high pressure into an area of low vapor pressure. So the leaf is going to have higher vapor pressure. The atmosphere is going to have lower almost all the time, except for maybe a rainforest. So water leaves. Tension is created in the cell walls where the water evaporated from. So the water evaporates out from the leaf. And then as the tension is created, adjacent water molecules are pulled in due to cohesion. That's because of the hydrogen bonds in water. So we lose some water to the leaf, adjacent water molecules are pulled in. This kind of continues down the water column so that the entire water column is pulled up to replace the molecules that were lost out of the leaf. So water keeps leaving, and this increases the pressure down the xylem, which brings more water up. So we've got this whole continuous column basically, and it's just leaving out the top. And because of that pressure that's being created, it's bringing water up from the bottom and from the roots. So in the roots, the water is moving up and out, which reduces the water pressure, such that the water vapor pressure in the soils is higher, and the water is brought in, again, going from high pressure to low pressure. So really the ability of trees to even get water relies on the fact that they lose water out of their leaves. There are certain instances where the roots can actually directly increase or decrease their own pressure, their own water pressure. But that's only in times of like extreme drought, when it's been a very long time without natural transpiration. The tree sort of shuts down any photosynthesis and holds onto its water a lot tighter. So in those times when it needs to get water up to the leaves again, but there isn't much in the soil, it can force the gradient by pumping ions into the root itself, which decreases the water pressure, and then that'll bring some water into the roots. But that's about 5% of the time. 95% of the time relies on this cohesion tension theory, which is just taking advantage of the laws of physics. So this all happens through the xylem, which is basically like the big old straw through the tree transporting water. So the xylem itself is a bunch of porous cells combined end to end to make long perforated tubes that are directly adjacent to each other. So at a cellular level, you just have a bunch of tube-like cells all stacked on top of each other to make one big long straw from top to bottom. And then these straws are all next to each other, creating a greater area for the water to travel through. So what divides the adjacent cells so that it's separate different straws? Bordered pits. And these pits also exist at various checkpoints along the xylem. And this is the way that trees can, quote unquote, control cavitation. So cavitation can result to death in the tree. We're going to get to that in just a quick second. But the bordered pits are basically like a porous surface, sort of like a colander. So it's just like a plate that has some holes through it. This allows water and air to move between the xylem cells up and down. And horizontally between the different straws, quote unquote. So because the xylem cells are porous, so they have to be porous in order for the water to be able to travel through them. But that also means that air can seep in due to the pressure differences. So if there's just water in here, the air pressure is going to be very low, and it's going to, at times, bring in air from outside. So that can cause air bubbles to form. And if those expand too large, this can cause a break in the water column. So this is called an embolism. That's also a thing for humans in the bloodstream, and it's not great. So if embolism gets out of control, that can result in cavitation, which when it becomes runaway cavitation, can actually kill the tree. So if you get a an air bubble that's too significant within the xylem and it spreads horizontally to all these different xylem tubes, eventually it's going to completely ruin the continuous unbroken water column that the entire cohesion tension theory relies on, and that can completely eliminate the tree's ability to take up any more water and spread water to critical tissues that it needs to stay alive and keep growing. So in order to avoid cavitation, there's this structure called a torus, which is sort of like a cap. And at default, it stays separated from the bordered pits, so it allows water to move between them. But if there's a difference in pressure, so if air pressure builds inside of the xylem tube because of a bubble being formed, the torus moves in response to that, slides over and closes off the bordered pit, which limits the cavitation to a single xylem cell instead of the whole water column. So it's sort of just like a safeguard, basically a cap to close off the colander, which is the bordered pit that exists between xylem cells. So it's a really cool, very complicated function in order to prevent an embolism and runaway cavitation from happening. So it's just a way to keep water only inside of the xylem and keep air out, just to maintain that continuous unbroken water column. So pretty cool how they can respond to environmental changes. And as Tatiana has graciously drawn, this is exactly how it works. So life juice bag, and there's an air pocket, and that's a bad time. When that gets in there, it's going to be not great. But lucky for the trees, they have these bordered pits. So once it gets in there, it'll be limited to just one cell in there instead of running away and killing this poor tree's branch and then the whole tree itself. That face.
What is? Yeah, I'm like, what is with the face?
Three-person arm.
Everyone
Their
knows
faces
trees'
in their
faces are in the
legs.
ground. Yeah, come on, guys.
Yeah.
Did I not say that?
They also have very cool bear tattoos. If you
Yeah.
I saw the bear
didn't
tattoo and
know.
I was like, oh, envious.
Look at that muscular arm.
Yeah. Shout out trees. They all have bear tattoos. We just can't see those either. So, and their faces are obviously in the ground, but we'll get to that in a second. So yeah, basically the xylem it's a bunch of dead cells, but it's also very, very specialized in a way to statically prevent runaway cavitation and death of the tree. In extreme drought conditions, that can just happen anyways if the tree isn't getting enough water from the roots, but it prevents sort of just like accidental slip-ups and is a pretty good safeguard mechanism. So pretty dang cool if you ask me. So other drought-tolerant tactics. So in times of water stress, trees can detect that in their roots by limited water intake, and then the roots experience a drop in turgor pressure. So that was that water pressure inside of the cells that we talked about with the stomata opening and closing. And this directly causes the roots to produce abscisic acid, ABA, and this starts a whole signaling pathway, kind of like what we saw with the stomata again, where the light was the input and the ion movement and closing of the stomata was the output. And this feeds into that. So it closes the stomata and preserves water, and it reduces photosynthesis rates, but trees will take that sacrifice. So trees will respond to environmental stressors and allocate resources to whatever is the most pressing stressor at the time. So if they need to obtain more light, they'll grow in such a way that they can potentially do that. If they need more carbon dioxide, they will limit other parts of the photosynthetic cycle in order to obtain that. And if water is a limiting resource as well, they'll just kind of cut off the whole thing and say, okay, we need to focus on keeping our water. I shouldn't personify trees so much, but Whoops. And yeah, so they have for how static they are, there's a lot going on inside basically. So there's all these different pathways and all these different chemicals and hormones involved, and it's actually very complex. And I don't understand it all, so I'm not going to try to explain it all. But we're just doing some high level stuff here. So pest resistance as well. Trees can actually produce toxins and repellents in their sap. Um, Again, I don't know the exact mechanisms of that, but they can respond to signals from the environment to produce these toxins and repellents. They can release airborne compounds that attract natural predators of pests. So there's been studies done on like tomato plants and other little saplings that show that they can actually, in response to pests, release airborne compounds that attract like larger flies and things like that. If a hole is burrowed in the bark, they'll plug it with sap immediately in order to try to expel the intruder and limit damage. And then some of them just straight up grow armor, crazy ass spikes like that. Never a bad tactic if you want to not get eaten by big things. So a lot of different pest resistance strategies. And now we're going to get to tree communication. So this is real cool. Trees can actually communicate with each other when they're stressed. Not always just when they're stressed, but usually it revolves around stress. So this can be done via the release of airborne chemicals. So the ones that I mentioned before, they can also trigger other trees to start releasing the same chemicals, as well as produce their own defenses. The main way is the transfer of chemical signals through their root and fungal networks. So, mycorrhizae are fungi that grow symbiotically on tree roots and aid in nutrient uptake and signal transmission. So, in this relationship, the fungi grow on the roots of the trees and they get photosynthetic sugars from the tree because the tree will usually produce more than it actually needs. So, it'll send some extras down to the fungi. And in return, the fungi help the tree uptake nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium from the soil and water as well. And then they can also transfer those to other trees through root networks and fungal networks, and they can actually send signals. So they can stimulate responses in their neighbors. So they can stimulate their neighbors to change their morphology, for example, produce more sap in the inner bark to prepare for pest burrowing. Or to change their biochemistry, for example, increase toxins and repellents in their tissues, or produce the airborne compounds that attract natural predators of pests. So the trees can actually give each other advanced warnings. So if one's getting decimated by pests, it can sort of send that warning signal through this root fungus network to other trees that then spurs these responses in the others so they can be better prepared for the oncoming attack. So they're looking out for their buddies. And it can also probably be used to gossip. I think we can all agree that everything revolves around that.
Go speak to Mother Tree.
Exactly. So this is why their faces are in the ground, is because that's where all the talking happens, is underground. So
Keep it secret.
That's cute.
yeah. So everything revolves around gossip. It would be naive to assume they don't. And through these same fungal root networks, they can also share nutrients. So, it's been shown that coniferous trees can share resources with deciduous trees depending on the time of year. So, for a coniferous tree, they keep their needles year round. So in the they don't photosynthesize in the winter, even though they have their needles. They don't photosynthesize. It creates a cavitation risk actually, and then the sap just freezes up, and they can't actually move nutrients around. So they just go dormant over the winter, like deciduous trees, but they keep their needles. So in the late fall, they can still photosynthesize, but the deciduous trees have lost their leaves. And then also in the early spring, the deciduous trees haven't grown their leaves yet, but the conifers have their needles. So it's been shown that the conifers will send extra nutrients, so nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, to the deciduous trees during these times. And then when the deciduous trees grow all their leaves in, they have a greater surface area of photosynthetic surface area. So then they'll in turn share the nutrients right back to the conifers. So just a nice symbiotic relationship. There are also trees that just try to inhibit growth of other trees around them. So it can be used for evil as well, but hey, got to survive out there somehow. And also, it's been shown that dying trees can share nutrients to their neighbors that have a greater use for those nutrients as well. So, if a tree is being overrun by pests, it's tried to warn its buddies, and then right at the end, it'll just send out a bunch of those ions, and those will go through the root networks and into the neighboring trees. So, these communication and sharing networks rely on hub or mother trees. So, these big trees that have the huge root systems, they've been shown to be connected to up to 47 others in a study in British Columbia. So, pretty extensive network. And these networks were also shown to lose I think it was about 30% of their capacity when only a handful of mother trees were removed as compared to removing the same number of random trees only resulted in like a 10% decrease in the network. So these larger trees are really critical for these sharing and communication networks, and it's a good thing to know going forwards, just in terms of maybe advancing logging practices to only take smaller trees, leave some larger trees up that can facilitate faster regrowth of a healthy forest after logging, and sort of just anchor the stability of the general area. So, yeah. So, in conclusion, trees are very cool and smart and more complicated than just telephone poles with leaves. Please go hug one. And huge shout out to Tatiana for all the incredible art, including this little icon she did up. Real talented. Thank you so much. And that's that. Yay.